volume of IT Service Management. Our presenter today is Phil Simonti. All right, we have surveys available in the room. If you would jot down your thoughts and provide some feedback for the presenter, we'd appreciate it. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you. Maybe the first thought is, how do we attract more people to our presentations in the future? So if you have some good ideas after we're done, we'd be glad to hear them. So I'm Phil Simonti. Now let me introduce some of the other people that are here, because we have some experts in the crowd. We have John Hergert sitting here in the front, and John is the process owner for Sacrum and Change. We have Dilip Paul, who's the capacity and demand process owner. In the far back, Karen Odakara, availability and event. And we have Rich Arpke, who's also part of our team and works with all of us in the process integration space. So the purpose of this presentation is to hopefully increase ITIL awareness. We'll go over some key concepts and terms. We'll talk about some of the ITIL processes and hopefully increase your acumen within those processes. And then we'll try to explain and draw the correlation between process integration and how it supports service, the delivery of our services. So what I'm going to do, next slide, and there's a lot of these slides that paint, by the way. Okay. So maybe I'll just give you the finger as we go. So we're going to walk through some key terms. We're going to look at a process portfolio. We're going to concentrate on the 10 processes that we've deployed within ITO. And we'll talk about process integration, as I mentioned. We'll try to correlate that back to service performance. And then there's some key links we'll make available in the presentation, and we'll have some time for Q&A as well. Okay, so let's start with some key definitions. IT Service Management, ITSM. ITSM is the implementation and management of quality IT service. Quality is being defined by the customer with the service delivery teams. The thing about services is that you provide services to customers, they don't have to worry about the risk and the costs associated with delivering those services. ITSM is performed by a key mix of people, process, products, which are tools, and key suppliers. When we design a service, we package those 4 Ps into the service, and it's important that people that are delivering the service understand what their role is. They have OLAs to back up their role, and the processes, they all play a role in executing the process activities and tasks, and we need to make it very clear what those are so that they can be successful. We're using, within ITO, to develop our services, we're using ITIL, the IT Infrastructure Library, as our framework to guide us as we establish and improve our ITSM capabilities. We're using ITIL version 3. It was released back in 2007. It was just updated this summer. And that's the basis for the services and processes that we're designing and launching within ITO. Okay, some additional definitions. In IT, we deliver value to our customers in the form of services without the customer having to worry about the specific service costs and risks. Examples of IT services in ITO would be a server service, called a Global Open Systems Hosting Service, a network service, web hosting service. Now, services facilitate outcomes that customers want to achieve by enhancing the performance of the tasks required to deliver the services. The majority of the tasks that are necessary to deliver the services are defined within our processes. A process is a structured set of activities and tasks designed to accomplish a specific objective. The process takes one or more inputs and turns them into defined outputs. A function, like the Global Service Desk, which I'm sure you heard of, it's a logical grouping of people that are assembled together to perform a particular process or activities of a process, and sometimes they perform activities that span multiple processes. So one of the things we do is as I mentioned, we design our services, we package processes into the services, make it very clear how to execute those processes, what the roles of all the people delivering the services are with regard to those processes, and we integrate those processes together. We talk about a process taking one or more defined inputs and turning them into outputs. We make sure that we really understand how one output from one process is going to be received as an input for another process. make sure we get agreement on those inputs and outputs, and exactly what is delivered between the two processes. And that's really the key and why we're here today, to talk more about that. So next I'm going to get into the process portfolio. In ITIL, there are 26 processes, which are documented in 5 books, organized by service lifecycle. We start with the strategy, and you can see the 5 processes in the space of strategy. And it's really about connecting with the business, understanding the goals and strategy of the business, and then developing your service strategy to match those goals or support the goals of the business. So you see processes like strategy management and financial management, so we know how to account, budget, and charge for our services. Demand management, which we'll talk about in a bit. After you develop those strategies of how you're going to meet the business needs, you start to design your services, and there's a number of processes within the design space. You'll note dates next to a couple processes. Those are the dates, those are the processes that we've launched within ITO, and those dates tell you when we've launched those processes, and those are the ones I'm going to focus on in this presentation. The other thing I mentioned before we go on is that processes may be designed, may be included in a life cycle like design, so availability and capacity. When we design a service, we want to make sure that we're designing the infrastructure that supports the service so that it can meet the availability targets of the service. Same with capacity. You want to make sure that we're designing our services to meet the needs of the business and the anticipated capacity needs. So those processes are part of the service design life cycle, but a lot of the activities within those processes are executed in the operational phase. The next life cycle would be service transition. And that's where we're taking our designs, we're building our services, and then we're transitioning those into production. So you can see a number of services, and you're probably familiar with many of them. We'll talk more about change and service asset configuration and knowledge in a bit. Being that we're from ITO, we've concentrated on the operational processes. So you see a lot of dates next to the 4 of the 5 processes in the operations space, as you might expect. We really want to focus on those processes because that's what we're doing in ITO. We're operating our services primarily. And the last process is continual service improvement. And that's something that is part of every life cycle and is part of every process. We're continually trying to evaluate, improve our processes, and how we build our services and design our services and transition our services. So that's really present in something that's very important to us and something that's present within every life cycle. Okay, so when we launch a process, what does it look like? What does success look like? We start by creating policies and what we call a level 2 process flow. And that's a simple swim lane diagram that shows all of the functional teams that are accountable for executing a particular activity within that process. We define the policies, process, roles and responsibilities for executing the process, and the key performance indicators, or KPIs, to show how we're going to measure the success or the performance of the process and really drive some behaviors to achieve those performance goals. We develop a level 3 process procedure, and that brings in more detail on how process activities and tasks are carried out, and it introduces tools. If we do have enterprise tools that support the process, like BMC Service Desk for incident management, we introduce the tool in the level 3 procedure. And then we ask our functional teams that are responsible for specific activities and tasks to write detailed work instructions that specify the exact steps that they'll follow when they carry out a process activity or task. And you might see those for fulfilling a request. What are the tasks involved with fulfilling a request? Or implementing a change, resolving an incident. It's vital that we identify players in 3 main roles for each of our processes. A champion who sponsors the ITIL process. A process owner, we have 3 of them in the room today. They actually do the first couple of bullets up top. They define the process, they mature the process, and they continue to drive improvement in this process. And then we identify process managers, and they're typically embedded in the functional teams, and they're responsible for the day-to-day quality and integrity of the process execution. And then lastly, continual improvement. Our initial launches of our processes, we follow ITIL best practices, but sometimes we're limited in scope, how many of the activities that we actually launch and how deep we go within those process activities. But then we use continual improvement to look for areas for improvement, to help support the delivery of our services, and we drive improvement where needed. And we use our KPIs as a basis to see where performance is lacking, and it helps us drive our improvement plans. Okay, so this slide, lots of names on it. In the first column, you see our 10 processes that we've launched within ITO. And I mentioned we have a process champion. So it's one of Paul Landry's direct reports. So there's one per process. You see Kevin and Sakis and Chuck and so on and so forth. And then we have 5 process owners. Each of them own 2 processes. So we have John in the room and Dilip and Kieran, as we discussed earlier. They own, as process owners, they own 2 of the processes. Here's John, James, and Sakis. If we look at the top row, the blue section, those are the 11 services that we've designed and deployed within ITO. Starting in order, or actually in order of when we launched them. So storage was our very first service, followed by GOSH, and then the network services. The next row below that, you'll see service managers. They're responsible for performance of those services, so they have some key performance indicators that they track. They drive continual improvement. They do benchmarking to see how well our services stack up against the industry. Then I'll jump down to the yellow section there. And those are our process managers. And as I mentioned, they're responsible for the day-to-day execution of our processes. So they're supporting the functional teams, the people that are practicing or executing our processes. These folks are supporting them. In many cases, they're embedded in the organization. So if you look at request and problem and capacity in particular, all of those process managers are part of the functional teams, whether they're in planning or operations or engineering. They're embedded in the functional teams, and they're helping to execute those processes. They're typically squaring off with what we call a process practitioner. Those are the folks that are executing the processes on a daily basis, maybe like an incident manager, responsible for queue and service desk. Okay, so now I'm going to go touch on the purpose of each of those 10 processes. And we'll ask people in the room for support if we need it. We're going to have Q&A at the very end, so if you have any questions, we'll get them to answer it. Okay, demand management. So this is one of Dilip's, actually this whole slide is one of Dilip's processes. The primary purpose of demand management is to understand, influence, at times, anticipate and influence customer demand for our services. And there's really a strong integration between demand and capacity to make sure that demand passes the appropriate information to capacity so that we have enough capacity to meet the expected demand. Capacity is there to make sure that we have the right amount of capacity on hand. Too much capacity results in too much inventory, too much cost associated with keeping inventory. Not enough capacity results in service poor performance, maybe a service is unavailable, or maybe we can't fulfill customer requests for additional service capacity. Change in SACM. As they say, change is inevitable. So change is the process that manages the life cycle of all changes. All changes need to be recorded and assessed and authorized and planned so that we're scheduling them at appropriate times. We need to have backup plans. Change is the process that makes sure that we do all those things so that we can enable beneficial changes to be made with minimal disruption to IT services. SACM is one of our foundational processes. What SACM does is you design a service, you identify the key components that are needed. Infrastructure in our space, we're doing a lot of technology type services like servers and databases and so on and so forth. So we identify all of the components that are required to deliver those services. And SACM is a process that manages those assets, the information about those assets, the relationships between those assets. and it's used by many processes like change. So change could do analysis on a change and understand the potential impact of the organization. Like incident, when an incident comes in, it may look at SACM to say, well, you're calling because your application is down, and then it might use SACM to determine the criticality of your application. Is it an A, B, C type thing? Or your server is down, so who's impacted by it? How do I prioritize this? And I also use this information to understand and to do some investigation and diagnosis. Your application is down. Well, I see that I have a server down, and I see that your app's hosted on that server. So there you go. That's how I can restore your app and your service as fast as possible using this information.
The acronym
Service Asset and Configuration Management. Availability and events. Availability ensures that the level of availability delivered in all IT services meets the agreed availability needs and or service level targets in a cost-effective manner. Again, if you're designing new services, you're designing your infrastructure to support those services, and you're designing it to meet the availability targets agreed with the customer. Event is the process that's monitoring all those key components that help deliver the service, things that are important for producing those service outcomes that we've talked about. Event detects changes in state of configuration items or components. It classifies them as either informational, warning, or an exception. So if you try to log into a server, for example, it would capture that as an informational type exception, event, and would maybe capture it in the log file. If we were tracking or monitoring network bandwidth utilization, event, and let's say we had a couple of thresholds. We know when we hit 60% network utilization that we want to kick off a warning. Okay, it could lead to some issues. Let's say 70% is when you're actually going to experience some performance issues or maybe some downtime. So event would take that 60% and say, oh, I'm going to log a warning. I see this happening. If the 70% threshold came in, then it would record an exception. And typically results in an incident to restore that because we know at that point service is impacted, maybe down or not performing like it should. Incident and request. Most people, I would say, in IT have a good understanding of what incident management is all about. The purpose is to restore normal service operation as quickly as possible and minimize the adverse impact on the business. Some people confuse incident with problem. Incident is just there to restore service as fast as possible, not determine root cause. Request was a process introduced in ITIL version 3, and the whole intent is to manage the lifecycle of service requests from the users. The purpose and intent of it is to make life easier for our customers. They give them a means to request services, standard changes to services, or maybe some information about our services. By standard changes, I mean the things that are requested over and over again. They're very low in risk. They're highly proceduralized. Request is usually backed by a workflow tool. So we give you, through the request process, a means to record a request. We use workflow in the background to submit, to fulfill the request. And maybe we submit tasks to different groups that are needed to do something in order to fulfill your request. Problem and knowledge is the last two problems or processes that we'll talk about. Problem has two main reasons for its existence. Number one is to prevent incidents from occurring, and number two is to minimize the impact of incidents. Okay? So it does this in two ways. So we record a problem, and we start to investigate the problem and look for root cause. We may figure out a workaround. We record the workaround in what's called a known error. It becomes part of the known error database. Known error with the workaround. That information is passed back to incident, and that way incident, as they're investigating an incident, they may look in the known error database and find a workaround, and boom, they can shorten their investigation diagnosis time and just apply that workaround. Something may be like a configuration. Go back to my network example. We hit the upper threshold on the network utilization. maybe it's been happening, and so we'll have a workaround that says if it happens, you can configure this router and you'll route traffic, network traffic to another path. Knowledge is a transitional process. It's defined in the transitional life cycle. And it's all about when you create new services or change services, it's about capturing the information and knowledge that's needed to then deliver those services later on. We capture it in the form of knowledge articles or desk procedures like I talked about earlier. The process is all about managing that knowledge, making it available to the people that need it when they need it. Pretty simple. A good example, before I move on, is Global Service Desk. We've been creating the Global Service Desk. We're trying to, and we're designing services, we're trying to pass knowledge from the level 2 teams to the Global Service Desk, but they can handle some of the incidents, the low-level incidents. We do that through our knowledge management process. Okay, some integration examples. So as the top says, process integration enables more effective and efficient processes and services. I'm going to take you through a couple examples here. Hopefully this will make some sense out of the whole integration theme. And this will be a fun paint. So we'll start, by the way, the processes in green as a strategy process. Design would be the darker blue, capacity and availability. Transition would be the gray bubbles there, and then operation processes are the blue color before along the edges here. If we start with demand, as I mentioned earlier, it's one of the strategy lifecycle processes. So within demand, we're trying to forecast, working with the business, trying to forecast demand for our services. We pass that information to capacity, so capacity could plan for that those requests that are going to be coming. Capacity, in turn, will provide actuals. So what was the true utilization of our capacity? Pass that information back to demand, so demand can take a look at how well they're forecasting and make improvements where necessary. Capacity takes that information. It creates capacity plans based on forecasts, based on actuals, and sometimes it could do some tuning work so that we can instead of procuring more capacity, we can tune and meet the needs of our customers through our tuning efforts. We may raise a change request to get the okay to do those tuning exercises, or maybe we can move stuff around, move storage around ourselves. Maybe we've allocated storage that's not being used. We see that we can move it around to meet future demand. The other thing we do is we develop a capacity plan, and that capacity plan says, I know that I'm going to need to procure more capacity every 6 months. I'll give you an example. Let's say we're building, we want to start producing cars in Asia Pacific. We build 2 new plants. Demand would be working with the customer and saying, we're going to put these 2 new plants in Asia Pacific. They're going to have a need for some network bandwidth. So here's the forecast for that bandwidth. So capacity plans for it. They're procuring new additional bandwidth. They're also identifying some thresholds, like I talked about earlier. Maybe 70% is my lower threshold, 80% is my upper threshold. Capacity passes those thresholds over to event, so event could monitor the bandwidth of the network pipe and act accordingly. Availability is also passing some plans over to event, and availability is trying to meet the service level targets for availability. So it needs to pass that information to event as well, so event may know when services will be unavailable, or when we're going to be doing some maintenance so that we can meet our availability targets. Now, event, as I mentioned, is looking at the environment, monitoring the state changes of our configuration items. It could be recording an incident, it could be recording a change, or it could actually be recording a problem if it sees things happening over and over again, especially warnings maybe that haven't led to an incident yet. We want to cut off before they do. So event may record an incident. Now, incident, I would say incident, change, SACM probably are integrated with the most with our processes. And I'm only showing a few examples here, kind of weighted in the incident space, but the other processes are just as integrated. So incident, it's using information from the service asset and configuration management system, or configuration management system, some CI information relationships so that it can prioritize, investigate, and diagnose incidents. As it's doing that, it may also look for workarounds that are then captured in known errors to quickly resolve an incident. Going to that network example that I just gave you, let's say every week at a certain time we're hitting that threshold of our utilization. So we're recording incidents, and we're able to do a configuration change so we can route traffic another way and resolve the incident. Well, the incident process folks, they see that happening every week. So now they record a problem because they've seen this reoccurring incident. So that's the link down to problem management. And they're also providing information back to availability. So how often are outages occurring with our components and our services? So the availability can make improvements where needed. Problem, as I mentioned, does two things. It minimizes the impact of incidents and prevents incidents from happening. So as problems are recorded, we'll record those workarounds and the known errors. But we do the root cause analysis, and if we do decide we want to make a change to resolve that issue, that problem, we have to, in most cases, we have to create a change request before we can implement the solution. Then we implement the solution, and we update our knowledge management system with that information. Maybe it's the solution, maybe it's the procedures that are used to help solve it if it ever pops up again. The other thing I'll mention, problem, a definition of a problem. It's the unknown cause of one or more incidents. So when you don't know the root cause of an incident, it results in a problem record. I mentioned SACM as kind of a base process for many of our other processes. When we go to implement a change, we're looking at the configuration items and the relationships, really understand the impact of the change. Change also, at times, updates some of that information in the configuration management system. If we move something from one spot to another, if we change something from a development environment to a QA or production, at times the implementers of a change have to go into the configuration management system and update that information to keep it accurate. Finally, requests. As customers are making requests, there are times that we go from request out to SACM. SACM also handles procurement. So you need a server, I'm going to go to the SACM process, and they're going to tell me whether I have servers on hand in inventory that I can supply you, or maybe I have to go out and purchase or lease another one. Request may also use a freeze notification so that I know that you're making a request, and it's in a space where I have financial applications, let's say. And so when it's quarter close, I don't want to make any changes in that space. So I get the freeze notification from change, and I know to hold off for that weekend of fulfillment of a request that may cause has a business impact. Okay, so now I think I have one more slide, and then we'll open up for questions. This is just a summary slide. So let's review. We started out with some of these definitions, and hopefully they're making more sense now. So at the very top, process integration enables more effective and efficient processes and services. Services facilitate outcomes by enhancing the performance of the task required to deliver the service. Processes document the activities and tasks and continually improve them. Processes take one or more defined inputs and turn them into defined outputs. If we get agreement between the processes on how we integrate those inputs and outputs so that we're on the same page of what's sent, what's received, and what it contains, then we increase the performance of our processes, typically referred to as efficiency and effectiveness, which in turn allow the consistent delivery of value to our customers realized through our services. Hopefully that tied it all together for you. 10 minutes. Time for questions.
On the slide previous to this one, when you were describing SACM, you said it's for the procurement. That process is also used for procurement of servers and others. So how come it different from the capacity planning? Means the process which was initially working with demand management, and how it differ from capacity planning SACM? Because initially I perceived that the capacity planning will be responsible for getting more capacity, ordering servers and others. So how do those two processes interact?
Well, capacity, they have a plan that says we're going to need to add more servers to our pool. Typically, what IDLE tells you is they should be going through change management. They want to procure, and then from change, it would go over to request, typically. So within SACM, we have our procurement office, the asset side of SACM, service, asset, and configuration management. So we go to our business office to procure assets like servers. And that's why you see that relationship there between, we don't actually procure anything in capacity. We may initiate something, but the procurement happens in our business office, which is more associated with the asset side of service assets.
So capacity and SACM also interact with each other.
They do. Yeah, and I only showed, so I think we've agreed about close to 60 some integration points between our 10 processes, and I only gave you a couple examples to kind of get the point across. And the main point there is processes, they can only be so efficient and effective on their own. If they're not truly integrated with each other, they're not going to be that, the performance is going to be low. So you really need that integration and information from one process to another to make them perform well. And then in turn, your services are performing well because your processes are the ones that are controlling those activities that really enable the service to produce the outcomes that it's intended to produce.
So let me just expand a little bit on that. So one thing IDLE tries to do is break things down into clean little boxes, and that's what each of these processes are. They're trying to capture a complete known set of things and separate out other pieces from it. So in the SACM space, what we've done with asset management is just asset management. So it's the whole idea of being able to cleanly define asset management, and that's just only about buying assets, making sure we track them properly, and get them out of here if they're on lease, so we don't have any financial issues. And that's it. It pretty much puts a box around it. And then on the capacity side, it's the other piece of it. So what you were just talking about, the idea that you had that they were tied together, they are. But what IDLE tries to do is cleanly separate and put them into their own boundary areas of what this one does and what this one does, so that you can manage it.
I clearly understand what incident management is and how it works when it comes to operations. But in terms of problem management, how does it work if a specific application has unknown issues 2 to 3 times in a month? Which group, from your experience and knowledge, should take a lead to identify / investigate?
Typically, it's the incident. So the service desk or the level 2 teams that are resolving those incidents, those would be the teams that would record a problem. They see the incidents occurring over and over again. What we do in the problem space is a lot of times it's the same people. We look for the most appropriate person to own that problem and to facilitate the investigation and diagnosis. So the first thing you do is you identify the fact that incidents are recurring over and over again. Somebody from the incident space records the problem. We look for the most appropriate person to lead the investigation of that problem. They may identify, and they may have a team of people working on it. They may identify, many things that could be wrong, known errors. There's many known. You could have a software upgrade that you need to do. You could have a hardware upgrade. You could have a configuration change. All kinds of things. So if you record a problem, you can record one or more known errors associated with that problem, and then you really work to do root cause analysis of those known errors. You can start with a workaround so that you can resolve those incidents faster, and then you decide as you go through your root cause analysis, and what is it going to cost us to resolve this problem and prevent these incidents from happening in the future. depending on the cost and the resource availability, you may decide to solve it permanently. You may not. You may leave it with just a workaround.
5 minutes.
And if the particular root cause unknown incident requires engagement from cross-functional teams, which specific group, really wants the app to coordinate?
Every problem gets assigned to what we call a problem manager, and they would be the person that would coordinate the involvement of whomever, application teams, engineering, network teams, whatever it takes to resolve it. But usually you look for somebody that you think would be the best to facilitate that resolution. How many more?
About 3 minutes left now.
So common processes. I see a lot of different groups doing things differently. Is there going to be active effort to try to commonize?
Yes, and that's really what we're all about. We're really trying to, by defining the process, by writing procedures so people really know how to execute the process, we package those processes into each of our services, and we get a common execution of those processes. And really that's what it's all about. You get people doing it the same way, and then you have an opportunity to improve it. So that's really what our goal is, consistent performance that then can be measured, monitored, and improved. And sometimes we start really simple. Our processes on a maturity scale, change may be one of the more mature processes because we've been doing it for quite a while. Some of the other ones, we have a lot of opportunities for growth. Sites of interest. So the main thing about this slide, we've used this in many presentations, and I don't think we put a URL on it, but if you go to www.itsm.ford.com, you'll see a link, you'll see a process menu, and you'll be able to get to all of our 10 processes, and you'll be able to see the process guide that I talked about, the level 3 procedure, some shared procedures. It has our process owner's name there if you have additional questions. That process manager, that one slide that I had with all the people located on it, that's in our process integration site. You'll also see that underneath the process link. So if you ever have a question about a particular process, you could go to the process managers or the process owners. But we'll make this. And then if you go to ITSM, you'll see a number of podcasts out there for the tools that we use. We try to stress people to finish the IDLE training, and hoping that you all have. We've got a link to our methodology that we use to build services called SDBM, which is really based on SDM with some additional deliverables for creating services. And there's also a chance for you, if you have any questions, you can go to the site and submit a question, and they'll pass it out to the appropriate person. Okay? Thank you for attending. Appreciate it.
So with that, we'd like to thank Phil for the presentation, ITSM presentation, and also thank you for coming. Remind you, if there are surveys available, you can provide your feedback to Phil. You can leave this presentation or the surveys here on the desk or by the door, and we'll pick those up and get it back. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you.